What's that strategy look like at this point, Lindsey?
Yeah, nice to see you, Marni. I think the biggest disconnect for the Democratic Party is what the direction should be. And so if you look at something like what's happening in the New York mayor's race with Zohran Mamdani, it seems like there is a push to be even more liberal and people that are calling for those type of voices to come forward. But then when you look at the national stage, there are people that said some of the policies that focused on a lot of the issues that were maybe minor compared to people's pocketbooks at the time are still issues that a lot of Democrats do talk about. And so there seems to be a party that doesn't understand where it wants to go next. And then some people who are still not satisfied with the fact that Biden did step aside. You saw the former DNC chair, he started a podcast last week and said he had Hunter Biden on as his first guest. And they kind of agreed that Joe Biden was pushed out because his party left him in a way that Republicans generally don't leave. Even if people who didn't like Trump won't leave Trump, you know, they kind of try to band together. And so there's still a disagreement with whether Biden should have gave Kamala more than 107 days, whether it should have been Kamala in the first place, or what the party should do. But I think the biggest issue for a lot of voters who were in this with Democrats and voting on that side of the aisle are saying, if there was this big call to say that President Trump was fascist, and words like that were used often on the campaign trail, likening him to dictators, why was there not one plan put in place to see what the possible next steps would have been, especially since there was a huge call of the same language from when President Trump was president the first time. So people are just kind of confused about how we get to 2025 with no clear strategy, especially in the wake of all the things that President Trump is doing that are also lowering his own approval ratings.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There are so many disenfranchised by the extremes and just find politics unrelatable right now. How important is it, Lindsey, that the Democrats have a face, have a leadership, or at least a few obvious choices?
Well, I think what might be the best strategy is to figure out who already exists in the party. Like a lot of people are talking about Representative Jasmine Crockett. A lot of people talk about Bernie Sanders and AOC that are already very vocal. And then who the new leadership would look like. Democrats did have a problem with some of those younger voters. And so perhaps it's time to bring in some younger voices and see what this new iteration of the party looks like. And it doesn't have to be, I think, everyone who's as liberal as Mamdani, but also just letting new voices in, because I think on both sides of the aisle, what the loudest critics say is that there's too much bureaucracy and too much following of these old school rules that don't apply to the current day voters or even younger voters, voters of color. And so people who do feel disenfranchised just want to know that their voices are heard, and they want Democrats specifically to get back to the American worker.
So it's important to have a leader for the next presidential race, but we've got midterms coming up. The Democrats would love to take back the House and have more control in Congress. What do you think the most likely areas they'll focus that attention across the country?
So as we talk to leaders across the country, they always say that, specifically Democrats, we are working on listening, putting our ear to the ground, and being very specifically in touch with voters on the economy and making things better. But what I think their best strategy perhaps could be in this moment is to look at all the things that Trump is not having a winning issue on. So if you look at the big, beautiful bill, Medicaid will get cut for thousands, perhaps millions of people. Those are the people that they should talk directly to. If you look at what's happening with immigration, a lot of people do agree that we moved in the right direction as far as limiting immigration, but a lot of people don't agree with the way that it's gone about it, that the president has gone about it and his team. So perhaps Democrats can get into that conversation and actually say, here's the bipartisan bill that we brought to the table a year and a half ago. We'd like to bring it back again. I think there are realistic conversations to make them align with some of the things that the whole country wants, whether Democrat or Republican, and they can gather some of those voters that don't feel like this first 6 months or 7 months in Trump's term is satisfactory. And so that is a huge moment for them to try to figure out how to get people who are on the fence on the side of theirs, or get people that were traditionally Democrats out to vote, because a lot of people did sit down and stay on the couch last year.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.